The following program contains coarse language and mature subject matter. Viewer discretion is advised.
Live from the prairie plains of Canada, direct from Winnipeg, Manitoba, around the globe and across all 24 time zones, at blazing speeds on the internet. It's time for the R-rated podcast talk show that promises straight talk and no bullshit. It's Night Talk with your host, Dr. Talk. No topic too taboo, nothing's too risque. He takes it all on for your entertainment. So settle in, turn it up, and tune in for Night Talk with Dr. Talk.
Okay, gang, we are live. Welcome to another episode of Night Talk with Dr. Talk. That's me. And as promised and promoted, my guest tonight is Mr. Chris Rutkowski, a ufologist, if I may use the term. One of Canada's most foremost authorities on UFOs, sightings, abductions, and all that jazz. We're waiting anxiously to hear some of the stories that he has to share with us. Chris, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Hello, everybody.
So, Chris, I understand you've also authored 9 books on the subject.
Actually, my 10th one is just out. So,
Oh.
Yes. Yeah.
And all having to do with UFOs.
All having to do with UFOs or strange phenomena of one kind or another. Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll you know what? I'll get right off the top.
Sure.
This is my most recent.
Okay.
Canada's UFOs Declassified. I was just over at McNally, and they have a whole bunch of them there for sale. They're available on Amazon too. And this is all about some of the most interesting cases from the Canadian government's UFO files. And there's reports from RCMP officers who saw things at close range, to reports from pilots, an analysis of reports, because this is all based on actual documents. None of it's made up. And it sort of delves into some of the most interesting stuff that's in the government UFO files up until about 1982. I'm working on another book to sort of cover from the 80s to now, but this covers from the 40s to the 80s.
Wow. That's covering a lot of ground.
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
And if we could go back, how in the heck did you ever get started in UFOs?
Well, I'm glad we have some time to talk about this. I guess, I grew up during the big space race, and I remember my parents plopping me down as a young kid in front of a big black and white TV set to watch one of the Gemini or Mercury launches, watching John Glenn get blasted into space in the early 1960s. So that's my introduction. And then I remember as in high school, that the teacher wheeled in another black and white, a little fancier black and white TV set into the classroom for us to watch Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. And from that, it really didn't take much to get me interested into, a little more astronomy stuff. There was actually an astronomy club at school, so I joined it. And this was about the mid-1970s. And during the 70s, there was a lot of UFOs that were being reported around the world and here in Manitoba. And there was extreme interest. There were police officers who had gone out to investigate. There had been investigators coming from all across North America coming here to investigate. And when I got into university in the mid 1970s, people were phoning into the astronomy department at the university to report their UFOs. The problem is that my astronomy profs thought the whole thing was nonsense. People are making it up, or they're just seeing things, or it's just stars, or it's just planets. And they were not crazy about the whole thing. Well, I was in my astronomy prof's office one day when a call came in from somebody to report a UFO. And he sort of was rolling his eyes and, oh, no, not another one of these. And I was in his office and I said, hey, you know what? The next time you get one of these calls, just let me know because my desk where I sat to do my studying was literally just around the corner from his office. And I said, just give me a shout. I'll take the phone call. So, it was just a matter of, I think, hours or something before a call came in. And I started talking with people and I started, you know, investigating and talking to people who had seen UFOs. And I ended up talking to dozens of people that year. I could probably explain a good 80%, 90% of what people were seeing. Honest mistakes. Some people had seen planes from funny angles or helicopters or bright stars and planets that were in the sky and maybe a satellite or two. But there were some that seemed a little strange and I couldn't explain those. And those are the ones that kind of piqued my attention. And people invited me out, if you don't believe me, come out and come to my farm and I'll show you where I had seen this thing. So I ended up going over to people's homes, to their farmyards, traveling around Manitoba. Very gracious people invited me in for lunch and supper. Who, getting some food out of this was a great plus.
Mhm.
Um, and I thought this was fantastic. And then what happened was after about a year or so, um, the head of the physics department approached me. And what happened that every Friday afternoon in the physics department, everybody, was getting winding down for the weekend, but every Friday afternoon, there was what's called the physics colloquium. And that what it meant was that some of the profs and graduate students would give a presentation in the little departmental um, boardroom on, some aspect of what they were researching, whether it's somebody was studying black holes or somebody was, doing something with nuclear physics and, a new way to split the atom or something like that. Um, and it turns out that they had a cancellation at the last minute. And the prof said, you know what? Professor Smithers or whatever his name is couldn't make it, some other commitment. Maybe, you've been listening to people to talk about these UFOs and they're in the news all the time. Why don't you give a little talk to our departmental colloquium? And I said, well, sure. Which made me a little nervous because undergrad students were never allowed to give these presentations. It was all, full professors and grad students. So I was a little concerned about that, but I thought, well, what the heck? I, threw together a couple of slides and I thought, okay, I can do this. And then just a matter of, maybe half a day before I was going to be giving my talk, my prof came to me and he said, you know what? The word got around that somebody in the physics department is going to be talking about UFOs. And so got leaked to the media, and the media want to come, and a lot of people want to attend this. So we've moved it out of the physics colloquium boardroom, which was only about 20 people on a big table, to the largest lecture hall in the entire university, which was 500 people. And I found myself giving this talk, and there were TV cameras there, and people were asking questions, and that was it. I was the UFO guy, and it sort of went from there.
So that's how it started.
That's the beginning of it. Yeah.
Mercy. Um, Now, to this day, you're still contacted by people, right?
Oh, yeah. Every week, I get reports from right across the country. Um, One other thing is that I also still get reports from some government agencies. Transport Canada, I'm on their list for receiving UFO reports from pilots. I've recently received another report from National Defense, from a report that was filed with National Defense. So I not only get reports from the average person on the street, but official reports, and those are people who don't believe that things exist or whatever, and there's no such thing as the reports. Oh, the reports definitely exist, and we have the documentation to prove it. And this it's really something that's going on, and whether people want to accept it or not, people are always seeing something in the sky. In fact, there have been some polls that have been done that show that about 10% of the Canadian population, which is the same as the American population, 10% believe they've seen UFOs. That's a significant number of people. So in Canada, what is that? About 4 million people
Yeah.
believe they've seen UFOs. So if you've seen one, you're in pretty good company. And we've got reports from not just the average person on the street, but people who are decent observers. I mentioned, we have reports from RCMP, we have reports from pilots, air traffic controllers. It's pretty common to get these cases, and so every year we have somewhere around between 750 and 1,000 separate UFO reports that are filed in Canada from people who have seen UFOs. And by the way, I'm going to be using the Canadian term UFO. It actually started as an American term, but now the Americans seem to be shifting towards this term UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena.
Oh,
But in Canada, Transport Canada still uses the term UFO when accepting reports from pilots. So I'm still going to be using that. But it just shows you that this it's a very popular subject, something that's continuing. It's not a fad. In fact, I started, investigating, as I mentioned, in the 70s. In the late 1980s, I thought, we don't hear exact details of how many cases there are and characteristics of what people are seeing. So I took it upon myself to create what I was calling the Canadian UFO Survey. And so every year I put together all the cases that are reported, not just to myself, but to my colleagues across Canada, to the government, to other agencies, put them all together and do some analysis, and how many green ones are reported versus red ones, how many lights versus something a little more significant, what time of day, which province has the most, all that sort of stuff. And so we've been doing that since the late 1980s. And since the late 1980s, we have almost 25,000 separate UFO reports from Canadians.
wow.
So, that's a significant number.
What about Manitoba? What's our numbers?
Manitoba, it fluctuates. We didn't do well last year, but the year before, we had, I think, 50 or 60. Last year I think we barely cracked 20 or 25. I don't have the stats in front of me, but 2022 was a little bit down. And it turns out that the number of UFO reports in a province is related to the population. So we get more reports from Ontario and BC
Oh,
than
right.
anywhere else,
Yeah.
except that last year Quebec had the highest number of UFO reports.
Hmm.
Why that's so, we're not sure. Um, but and then in individual cities, of course, Toronto had the most, and Vancouver, and then it would after that be Montreal and so forth. So it does seem to be related to population. But having said that, sometimes there's pockets that seem to have more reports than they should. For example, the Maritimes, for the past 2 or 3 years, had more reports per population, per demographic than they should have. Why that is so, we don't know. Actually, the numbers went back down again last year. But that from time to time there are more reports in a certain area. I know people are always saying, "Where's the hot spots?" Well, it really varies from year to year. We can't really just say all the time, go to Halifax or go to Vancouver and Penticton or something like that. It really does vary from year to year.
Mm-hmm. Let me just backtrack for a second. You said that you receive official reports. Now, that doesn't include military, does it?
Yeah, it does include military reports. I don't think I receive all the military reports, but I have received reports from military officers on patrol or at various bases. It's the Canadian government hasn't really had anything in place in terms of investigating or recording UFO sightings since about the mid 1990s. Um, and I have to give you the history here in that um, from the 1940s until about the mid 1960s, um, the Royal Canadian Air Force, National Defense, was responsible for investigating UFO reports. And that's very similar to what was going on in the United States, where the United States Air Force was investigating. And then in the mid 1960s, the Canadian Armed Forces decided to get out of the UFO business. They said, there's nothing, this is more of a scientific problem than uh, a security or a defense problem, which is basically what the Americans were saying too. And so they looked around for a Canadian department to handle the UFO reports that were coming in. And they gave it to the National Research Council in Ottawa. And the reason the National Research Council took it on is because a lot of UFOs that are reported turn out to be meteors or big shooting stars, fireballs, that type of thing. And somebody in the National Research Council thought, if we get enough of these reports, some of the meteors that are coming in, if enough reports come in, we might be able to find the meteorites that are on the ground, what they've fallen, and you can find them in farmers' fields.
Mm-hmm.
So they said, let's take all the UFO reports, and some of those are certainly going to be meteors, and we'll find the meteorites. That actually happened a few times in Alberta in 1973, I think, where a lot of people reported seeing these bright shooting star fireball in the sky from a number of different directions, and they were able to triangulate, and they're actually able to find the meteorite on the ground, which was really cool.
Oh, wow.
Now, the thing about National Research Council is there's a bunch of scientists that are in Ottawa. Well, they don't really have the resources to travel across Canada to investigate. You need a lot of people, and they have to be covering a lot of ground, and it wasn't in their budget. But we already had an organization in the Canadian government that did have offices all across Canada, the RCMP. So the National Research Council of Canada got an agreement with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who had all their RCMP constables and officers across Canada to take UFO reports from people and then investigate them on behalf of the government. So we actually had this giant UFO investigating organization, the RCMP, which continued in about 1995. And in the 90s, what happened is that the National Research Council kind of moved away from meteors into things like the Canadarm, the thing that went on the space shuttle.
Right.
Um, and so they moved into the Canadian Space Agency. They were no longer interested in meteorites. So they said, well, let's work on something else. And so the RCMP were off the hook. The trouble is, UFO reports still kept being filed, and they didn't know what to do with them. Well, um, by that time I had already graduated with degrees in astronomy and education, and I was doing my own research. And I was in Ottawa in the 1990s, and I was actually at the National Research Council. I ended up having coffee or lunch, I think, even with one of the scientists who had been involved in this. And he was lamenting, what are we going to do with all these UFO reports? And it's not part of our budget anymore. And it's embarrassing if they're going to show up as part of our budget. So what do we do? And I said, well, you can always have people send it to me. And I was kind of joking. Um, but what happened was that I had completely forgotten about about the conversation until about 1999, a number of years later. And I had a phone call from some major, I can't even remember his name now, but it was a military officer, I think out in Nova Scotia. And he said, "Are you the guy we're supposed to be sending the UFO reports to?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" "Oh, absolutely."
Yeah.
And I started getting the UFO reports. So from 1999 until now, I continually get reports that are filed with National Defense, some through our CMP, although not very many, um, and others through Transport Canada, which routinely records cases that are reported by pilots. So, in addition to the average citizen, I get reports, from all over the place.
Now, what do you do with these reports?
Very good question. More than what they were doing with them. I mean, by they, I mean the National Defense, because they were not really investigating things at all. Although, from time to time, even the RCMP didn't investigate in detail a lot of the cases. In fact, a lot of them they just passed right on to the National Research Council, and the National Research Council people didn't investigate them. But from time to time, there was a significant enough case that they did spend some time and money and resources looking into it. So they did investigate some of them, but by and large, they weren't doing much. But as I mentioned, I was already by 1989 doing an analysis of the UFO reports in Canada. So I simply added these in to the database that I was doing. And if an interesting case came through, I would call them up. Of course, this was just at the beginning of the internet
Hmm.
and email. And once the internet started up, instead of faxing things and getting faxes of UFO reports, I started corresponding with people via email. I also traveled a little bit. I mean, it's not like on TV with the X Files where they just hop on a plane and travel all over the place.
Yeah.
um, within my limited budget, I could travel now and then. But of course, I had other associates. I have, like, there's people in BC who investigate cases in BC. There's people in Quebec who investigate cases in Quebec. So between the bunch of us, if an interesting case came in, we would investigate. So we became our own version of the X Files. And people have called me the Fox Mulder of Canada. So maybe that's my role. It's better than being called better than the Scully, I suppose. I don't know.
Yeah. Um, have you ever done an investigation into a sighting, like actually gone somewhere and viewed debris or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've investigated many cases. I mean, I've traveled out to BC to look at stuff in northern BC. I've been out to the East Coast to talk to people who've seen things that were hovering over their car as they're driving in New Brunswick. I've been out to Ontario and Quebec and all parts in between. Even here in Manitoba, there have been some fascinating cases that I've taken upon myself to, talk to the witnesses, try and poke around the grounds to see if there's, any evidence left behind. It used to be, oddly enough, in the 60s and into the 70s, a little bit, that there would be ground traces left. Sometimes, a UFO would land and take
Sure.
off again, and there'd be something left behind. Those are really, really rare. In fact, I'm hard pressed to remember any case like that from the past 5 or 10 years at all. It's usually just people see something, or something's detected on radar by air traffic controllers or pilots, and that's about it. But in terms of traces left behind, very, very rare, not just in Canada, but literally around the world, that they
Yeah.
seem to be almost absent.
Um, I guess most viewers would probably hope that you would reference something like the Roswell incident in 47.
Well, I mean, I mean, that's before my time, of course, but
Hmm.
um, that's the one that people usually point to as the ultimate case, the best case, that the one that started it all. Um, Actually, One of the things that I've done is I've actually done research, archival research, historical research, and interviewing other witnesses that are still around to fill in the gaps. I remember I started my Canadian UFO survey in about 1989, but we'd been investigating since the 70s. And there are also cases before that in Canada that were fairly intensely investigated. Um, and so I've been able to fill in historically a lot of other cases. So that even in Canada, we have cases going back well before 1947, well before Roswell.
Oh,
In fact, there are cases in the 1800s here in Manitoba, where a lot of people had described what were called mystery airships, where in about 1896, people had been seeing these lights moving in the sky, and people thought they could hear propellers and so forth, because they could see these objects moving in the sky. But of course, there were no airships flying over Manitoba at that time. Um, and even before that, the oldest case in Canada that we kind of ascribe uh, to a UFO or a unidentified phenomenon of some sort goes back to 1792, if I'm not mistaken, 1792, 1796.
wow.
Um, in northern Manitoba, the explorer. I'm trying to remember the name of the explorer now. Um, but he was one of the early people who was with some indigenous people in the First Nations, and he was looking around, mapping out the north. And as they were camped one night, they all saw this object, what they described as a blob of gelatinous material, very bright, that fell to the surface of a lake nearby with a with a plooshing sound, and then the light extinguished. So, there we have a UFO landing from the 1700s here in Canada.
Hmm.
Uh, so, there's lots of cases that go back much further than Roswell. And even in terms of Roswell, people are saying, well, it's the one that we have the most proof of and all that sort of stuff. Well, it turns out the United States actually denies that anything ever happened at Roswell in 1947. Um, in fact, we're not entirely sure what date it occurred. There was supposed to have been a storm one night, and there had been a few people who had seen lights in the sky and heard some thunder noises and that type of thing. And then later, a few days later, um, one of the ranchers came into a military station with a box of material, and he had said that he had seen this sort of stuff out on the range. And he took the material, military officers out. They found more material scattered all over the place, and that was the Roswell crash, supposedly. But the military has always said there was obviously just an ordinary balloon and so forth. And there's really no documentation about anything actually occurring, whereas in Canada we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation from the government that attest to UFOs being found or examined and seen and studied here in Canada. In fact, one of the most famous cases, one that one of my books is about actually, is the Falcon Lake case from 1967,
Ah, yeah.
where a fellow said that he was burned by a flying saucer out at Falcon Lake. And there's something like 300 or 400 separate pages of government documents, letters, correspondence, memos, analysis, that talk about this object actually being seen and by somebody, and the government took it very seriously. It was investigated by National Defense and the RCMP. We have nothing like that for Roswell. So, whether Roswell was, a really good UFO case or not, it's pretty much a lot of it is hearsay, but it certainly has stood the test of time in terms of carrying on the tradition of UFOs.
What about if I throw a name out at you, you can just sort of respond. Bob Lazar.
Yeah. What do I think of him?
Yeah.
There's a recent movie all about him. He's got a lot of people who believe him. But am in the camp that I personally don't think there's any evidence that he was telling the truth about what his credentials were, what happened to him, and what he saw, and so forth. Um, there's a lot of suggestion that a lot of the stories are made up. I'll give you one example. He said that he smuggled a chunk of element 115 out of the lab that he was working at, um, and he took it home in a briefcase, and it was very heavy and so forth, and supposedly this element 115 is somehow involved in the propulsion or the structure of the
Hmm.
flying saucers that they crashed. Well, and of course, excuse me, um, when he talked about this, element 115 had not yet actually been discovered.
Oh.
Nuclear physicists had not actually found it yet. And so people are saying, well, see, he predicted that this was going to be happening, and that's more evidence that he was telling the truth.
Hmm.
The trouble is, in reality, um, element 115 has been created in a laboratory for only a fraction of a second or two, and only a few atoms have actually been made so far, because it's created under bombardment of intense radiation. So there's no way that he could smuggle out a briefcase full of this sort of stuff. And considering the atoms are contained in a sort of a magnetic thermos in the middle of this nuclear facility, um, whether he could there's no way he could actually get to this thing to put it in a briefcase and take it home and so forth. So it's complete fiction. That's just one story that he said
Hmm.
that doesn't seem to have any support. He says that he worked at this particular lab, but there's no record of him actually being there. There's some evidence that he worked as a janitor. He can't remember some of his professors in university. He can't remember some of his high school teachers, and it's his story. It just seems like it's a work of fiction. So uh, this is the problem with this field, is that there's a lot of people who are saying a lot of stuff and making a lot of claims, but from a scientific point of view, we have to really examine these claims very carefully. What I sometimes say in my lectures is that it's very good to have an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out.
Hmm.
And you have to be very careful walking on the sidewalk these days, because there's so much gray matter just sort of laying there on the sidewalk. Not just with UFOs, but with everything. You know where
Yeah,
I'm going with that.
of course. Um, so, would you say that you're a believer?
It's interesting. Hardcore skeptics and debunkers say that Chris Rutkowski is a believer. Believers say that Chris Rutkowski is a skeptic.
Oh.
So, because I don't believe everything I'm told, I take everything with a grain of salt. I test it for veracity. I test it for possibilities. I want evidence. I want hard facts. I don't want to take something at face value if I can get to the meaning of what's being said and who's saying it. So in that sense, I don't accept everything. But at the same time, my astronomy background, all my astronomy colleagues, we're fairly convinced that there's life out there in the universe somewhere. And somewhere around, a distant star, there might be a planet that has developed life, and not just life, little amoebas or anything, but life like us. And maybe they figured out a way to travel, outside their planet, outside their star system, between the stars, and so forth. We don't know anything about how to do that very efficiently and quickly and effectively. But our sun is a pretty average star. Actually, I was corrected about this. It's actually not an average star. It's a very significant um, star in terms of stellar evolution. But it's neither very very hot nor very very cold. And it's also not very old. There are stars that are a lot older than our sun,
Mhm.
and not just 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years, but millions of years older. So if there's a civilization around a distant star that's, you know, let's say conservatively 100,000 years older than our sun, that civilization would have 100,000 years more of an advance on trying to figure out ways of traveling around the stars, between the stars. And if so, maybe they figured out a way not to break the laws of physics, but maybe bending them in ways that we can't even imagine yet.
Mhm.
So, is it possible there's life out there? Yes. But we're the ultimate doubting Thomases. We need to see some more, definitive evidence before we can say, yes, the aliens are definitely here. In terms of what people are reporting, I mentioned that, we have reports from pilots and RCMP and so forth. So when a pilot or an RCMP reports seeing a UFO, they're pretty good in terms of description. They're pretty good in terms of observation. Pilots tend to know what's in the sky and what's not. Um, so, and their chances are they're not making stuff up. Okay, yes, pilots make things up too, and RCMP and so forth, um, and they make mistakes. But the chances are great that they're pretty good observers. So we tend to believe when somebody comes to us and say, "I just saw something last night." Plus the fact that we can explain most of the reports that come in mean that if a person says, I saw a UFO last night, they saw something, they're not lying. We might be able to explain it. So people aren't lying when they see something, but maybe there's another explanation. And something, in fact, it's usually just a very honest mistake. Um, so, um, believing in the possibility of alien life is, pretty standard. And there have been polls that show about half of all Canadians believe that there is intelligent life out there. And why
Half?
not? About half.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
In your science background, when you bring that into ufology, does anywhere in there in the mix, um, let's see, how can I word this? Have you ever pondered a propulsion system from an extraterrestrial vehicle, how they got here, or how they're able to do what they do, flying in straight, 90-degree angle turns and all that?
Well, I mean, there's a when a person says that they've seen a UFO make a 90-degree turn. And it's one of the more common reports that we do get. Somebody's seeing a light in the sky, and all of a sudden it goes in the other direction. Um, Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, um, it turns out that um, what they're seeing is two things. They're seeing a satellite that's uh, going out of Earth shadow, sorry, going into the Earth shadow, and then one coming out of the Earth shadow from a different direction. So, it looks like one thing made a right angle turn, but they actually saw one go this way and disappear, and one go this way and disappear. So 90-degree turns may have other explanations, but the propulsion question is quite interesting. Um, it's hard to speculate on how things are flying. I know there's with some of the stuff that was seen by the United States Navy, they're talking about these things are flying in and out of water and flying circles around the jets and all this sort of stuff. And they seem to zip away at speeds that are, Mach 10,000 and things like that. Um, the trouble is you can't tell much from videos, and the way things move can be very very deceptive. uh, but in terms of propulsion systems, we already have a fairly good idea of how things in theory can go in terms of traveling between the stars. Right now in the theaters we have Avatar, and the premise of the movie is that we've traveled to Alpha Centauri and looked at this place called Avatar, which is a moon of a planet out there. There's speculation about light sails. There's speculation about nuclear propulsion, nuclear rockets, that type of thing. Um, so there's all sorts of speculation on what type of propulsion might be possible, but we don't really have anything on the drawing board that shows us exactly how to make these things and how things might be done. What we do need is um, a, 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 the UFO itself. We need the flying saucer,
Hmm.
and we can reverse engineer from that. Not just reverse engineer from a teeny tiny piece the size of a thumbnail, but reverse engineer a whole flying saucer. Then
Yeah.
we're talking about propulsion.
Yeah. Okay. Um, the there's another incident that I recall reading about many years ago, um, and I think I might be getting it confused with the one that you told about Falcon Lake. Um, wasn't there an incident by Sandylands?
An incident by Sandylands.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've had reports from all corners of Manitoba. Um, there's a recurring spook light out by Woodridge, which is Sandylands, which is
Hmm.
close to Sandylands, I suppose, where a number of people had seen a light moving slowly around at the end of a road, at the end of a highway. A number of people had seen it. I mean, there have been reports from Sandylands, but I don't recall anything significant from Sandylands.
Okay, the incident at Falcon Lake, the gentleman, do you remember his name?
Stefan Mihalik.
Okay. Then I am confusing the two because that's
Oh,
the name that I was thinking of.
yeah, maybe I should relate that to everybody in case people aren't familiar with it.
Sure.
As a matter of fact, I had lunch with his son today.
Oh, really?
Um, yeah. So here's the thing. 1967 was a big year for UFOs, especially in Canada. And one of the most significant cases happened on the May long weekend out at Falcon Lake. So set the picture. It was a pretty cool spring. In fact, there was still ice on the lakes. If you can imagine, May long weekend. Unfortunately, here we are at the end of March, and we hope spring is here. Well, unfortunately, chances are we're going to have ice on the lakes still in May in some
Yeah.
places. But apart from that, and the leaves weren't fully out on the trees yet. But this fellow named Stefan Mihalik, um, he was from Eastern Europe, and he had moved his family here after the war. And he was a bit of a rock hound. He was an engineer by trade and a mechanic. And he was interested in rocks. He was interested in nature and all this sort of stuff, but particularly rocks. He liked, cool rocks. He had actually staked some claims in the White Shell. Most people are probably not aware that there are, ore deposits in that part of the Canadian Shield. Silver, there's actually a gold mine which opens and closes from time to time depending on the price of gold. But there is that type of thing in eastern Manitoba. So he wasn't trying to strike it rich. He was just kind of curious and wanted to find out. Anyways, he takes the bus from Winnipeg on the Friday of the May long weekend in 1967, stays overnight in the Falcon Motel, and then about 6 o'clock in the morning, he packs a lunch, gets his knapsack, and trundles across the road into the bush, literally into the bush. And he, stops, hammers away at various rocks and things over the course of the next couple of hours, and then stops for lunch around noon. So it's a pretty, nice blue sky, really nice day. And where he had stopped was on a rocky ridge overlooking sort of a little creek and a swamp and a beaver pond. And there were some geese that were on the beaver pond down below, and he's munching on his lunch, and all of a sudden the geese get startled and all fly up, and he's thinking, "Oh no, there's probably a bear around here," and there are bears around there. So he's looking around, doesn't see any bears, but then his attention is drawn to some shining objects in the sky, and there were two kind of disc-shaped or cigar-shaped objects in the sky, very, very bright, very white, bright light coming down from the sky, and one sort of hung back while the other one came down lower and lower and lower and appeared to land on one of a kind of a flat part of the ridge, like about 100 meters away or so. So um, he crouches down behind this rock that he was examining, and where he was having his lunch, and there's some shrubs there, and he watches this thing, and as it lands, he sees it's starting to change color from white to yellow to orange to red, and then eventually he sees it's actually a sort of a metallic silver object, um, and it lands on this rocky ridge, and it's disc shaped, Hollywood style flying saucer disc with a dome, lights coming out of it, and it's about 35 feet across, 12 feet high, and he's watching this thing and he's thinking, what is this? Now, he'd been in the military. He knows what aircraft look like. He knows what a helicopter looks like. And he also noticed that this thing is made of what he thought, like he said, burnished aluminum or brass, like no rivets, nothing, just brushed metal.
Mm-hmm.
And he's watching this thing and he's thinking, well, what is it? And this was, and it's the middle of the Cold War. Apollo 1, which wasn't actually called Apollo 1 but this is just the beginning of the Apollo program. If you're a history buff, you'll know that the first Apollo mission ended in tragedy. The capsule caught fire on the launch pad, and 3 astronauts died. And this was all over the news. This was just a few months before. This was in the early part of 1967, and it was part of the space program. John F. Kennedy had talked about going to the moon. Apollo program was big news. So Mr. Mahalik thought, well, maybe this must be something from the American space program that got off course and landed in Canada, maybe because it broke down, maybe its engine had a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So he's watching this thing, and as he's watching it, he's seeing these lights flashing and whatever. A little door opens in the side of this thing, and he thought that he could hear high-pitched, squeaky voices. And he's thinking, "Oh, well, it's voices. So there is somebody inside. Definitely the Americans. Definitely the Americans." And it's definite that they, landed to make repairs because their craft broke down. He's a mechanic. This is how he's thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, he stands up and, very brave now, walks towards it, and he calls out, "Hey, Yankee boys, come on out. I'll help you fix your broken down flying machine." As he says this, the voices inside stop. And he's thinking, oh no, not Americans, Russians.
Ah.
See? Well, he happened to be from Eastern Europe, so he calls out in Russian, same thing. No reaction. Calls out in a few other languages, no reaction. By this time, he's standing like right in front of this thing. And he sees that there's a sort of an exhaust vent to one side, not too far from him, a bunch of holes in the side of this thing, and he pokes his head into this little door, and as he's doing, he braces himself with his hand, which has a rubberized glove. Well, the rubberized glove melts, and he quickly has to take his hand away
Oh
because
boy.
it's starting to burn. He pulls his head out, and the door shuts. The whole thing starts rotating until this exhaust vent is right in front of him. Now I'm going to turn around because somebody used a 3D printer to make the model.
Oh.
So this is what it looked like. you can see there's the door that opened in it,
Yeah.
and somewhere over here there was this exhaust vent, and uh, all of a sudden a blast of hot gas comes out of this thing, hits him in the chest, sets fire to his clothes, sets fire to the leaves and pine needles that are all around him, and the thing takes off. Well, he rips off his shirt, which is on fire, and then he stamps out some of the pine needles and leaves that were starting to smolder, and he's starting to get dizzy. He's starting to feel not very, very good. He feels that he's physically injured, and he realizes he has to get back to civilization. Well, but he's starting to get sick. He's throwing up. He's dizzy. His compass needle is spinning all over the place. Um, well, he eventually figures out the way home, and he starts staggering out of the forest. And he makes it to the highway. Um, and you can just imagine here's this guy with a cap on. He pulled on a jacket that he hadn't been wearing at the time, because to cover himself up. Otherwise, he would have been naked from the waist up. And he sees an RCMP car coming by, so he flags them down, and he says, "Hey, I just been burned by some ship or something. I need help." And the RCMP guy thinks he's drunk. Just imagine he's got vomit on him and all this sort of
Hmm.
stuff, right? Um, and the RCMP guy says, I've got some other more important stuff to do. So he initially pulls away, comes back, talks to him a little bit more, and Mr. Mahalik is thinking, you have to, tell people about the danger of what's going on in that just in the bush there. But the RCMP officer wasn't very helpful, drives away. Mihalik walks back to the motel, realizes he needs medical attention, and contacts his family back in Winnipeg and arranges for one of them to meet him back in Winnipeg. He has to wait for a bus to get back from Falcon Lake to Winnipeg.
Hmm.
So he has to wait until later that evening. He stays in his room and he's standing around outside. He thinks he doesn't want to contaminate people because he realizes something's happened to him.
Hmm.
Um, so he eventually waits, gets on the bus, you know, at the hangs around at the back. The bus comes back to Winnipeg. His family takes him to the Misericordia Hospital, where he's treated in the emergency room for burns to his body. They figure that they weren't sure what had happened. He said that he'd been burned by an airplane because he couldn't really explain to them about what had happened. But then when he gets home, he's really not well. He starts thinking, well, I don't want anybody else to get near this place. We have to warn people about what's going on out there. So he actually contacts the Winnipeg Tribune, and which was the paper that was in existence at the time. It's
Yep.
gone now, before the Free Press. Um, and there was nobody at the night desk because this was late on a Saturday night. But somebody got back to him, and they came and they investigated. They did a story on it. The next day, the world heard about this, and before you know it, there was a flock of people wanting to know exactly what had happened to him. And it became, one of the biggest stories around. They said that the family later complained that there were so many people hanging around their doorstep. Um, there were reporters and just hangers on and curiosity seekers. There's practically traffic jams on the front street. And in terms of newspaper and media people, there were so many media people with cameras with flash bulbs back then. That's how you took photos,
Yeah.
and this discarding the used flash bulbs. There's actually sort of a layer of broken glass from the flash bulbs on their front lawn.
Oh boy.
So it was quite spectacular. And then the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Air Force both investigated, and it was started this big production. And I'm going to back up again. I'm just going to stand up for a second. Well, here's the one of my previous books, When They Appeared. all about this particular case.
Oh,
And the title has nothing to do with aliens. The title refers to the fact that pretty soon, all these people, including the investigators, these military people, police, appeared wanting wanting him to tell the story. It was completely disruptive to the family. This fellow's kids, including this Stan Mihalik who I had lunch with today, he was 10 years old at the time, and he was bullied at school. Your dad saw aliens, that sort of
yeah.
stuff. He was actually beaten up because of it. It was very cruel back then. So it was disruptive to the whole family. And the RCMP and the RCAF took it very, very seriously. Remember, this was the Cold War. They wanted to know, they thought maybe the Russians did this. I mean, it seems to be possible. So they wanted to go out to the site where this was. But Mr. Mahalik was sick. He was injured. He lost a lot of weight. He couldn't hold food down. It was a matter of weeks before he was strong enough to actually get out of bed. Well, um, he had drawn a map of where this happened, and the RCMP and military people had gone out to take a look. They couldn't find it. They wanted him to come with them. So they flew him out there in a helicopter. He couldn't tell where anything was from the air. He'd never been in a helicopter before. Um, but eventually they landed and they took him in by foot to try and find this place. And they couldn't find where this happened. You'd think it would have been easy to find this, semi burned out area. But by that time, this was already a number of weeks. In fact, I think 4 weeks by this time. And the vegetation had sprouted on all the trees. Everything looked different.
Yeah.
The burned area probably had been overgrown with weeds and lichen and stuff. Every area around there looked the same. He couldn't find it when he was with the military police. Life magazine came out thinking they could do a feature on this, and they were disappointed because they couldn't find this site either. Well, it was a number of weeks later when Mr. Mahalik went out with some friends, and he did actually find the site. And then he later told the RCMP and RCAF about it. They went out. They actually took a helicopter out and surveyed the area and spent many hours analyzing the site. Curiously, they found radiation. This area on this flat rock was radioactive,
Really?
and they actually thought that it was too dangerous for the general public to be out there. So they thought about closing all of the White Shell Provincial Park to the public. By this time, it was July. Can you imagine closing
Oh, sure.
Falcon Lake and everything? So
Yeah.
they thought about it and they thought, no, let's not close the park, but let's just be careful about people going out into the bush. Well, the the dirt and whatever that was radioactive, they took samples, they sent it to Ottawa. They actually brought a radiation specialist from Ottawa to Winnipeg to analyze some of this stuff. Meanwhile, Mr. Mahalik was taken to the White Shell Nuclear Research Establishment in Pinawa, where he was taken a whole body count for radiation. His story was analyzed 6 ways from Sunday. Police and military officials, they interviewed his family, they interviewed the family friends, they interviewed his work, they checked his work, they checked the home. Like, this was an intense investigation. And it was really quite something. So here you have a case where you have somebody with an amazing story. He was physically injured. Radiation is found at the site. The site itself was found, and there's material found at the site. Um, and the National Defense and RCMP both issued statements that they had no explanation for what was found. And we have all this documented on official stationery and whatever, that this actually happened. That sounds so much better than Roswell.
Doesn't it, though?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not to mention, there is actually photographs of Mr. Mahalik's chest with the burn marks on it.
There's a number of photographs like that. He also, about a month or two later, he had semi-recovered. He'd gone back to work, and he was working at his workplace, and all of a sudden he felt dizzy, and he passed out. His body had swelled up as if some sort of allergic reaction, and he had these splotchy areas on his body, as if he, was allergic to something.
Hmm.
And that also was baffling. In fact, the following spring, because he still wasn't 100%, and he wasn't feeling back to normal, and he still had these recurring splotches. He went to the Mayo Clinic down in Minnesota on his own dime. He went there and they had a full physiological and psychiatric analysis. We have the psychiatric report. Oh, I should note we actually have the report from the emergency room physician that he saw at the Misericordia. He was examined by the military base physician and his own doctor, but he also went to the Mayo Clinic. We have their report on what they found. The psychiatrist at the Mayo Clinic said this guy is pretty down to earth, pardon the pun, and doesn't make up stories.
Hmm.
So, we have all this evidence plus the medical records. It's a really, really fascinating case.
Absolutely, yeah. Um, wasn't the burn marks that I mentioned on his chest, didn't they reoccur?
No, the rash reoccurred. The burn marks eventually faded. They were on his upper abdomen kind of area. They eventually did fade. They were not caused by radiation. People said he was burned by radiation. Well, no, he wasn't. That's actually a thermal or a chemical burn, like from a hot gas that had some chemical in it. And they eventually did fade, but um, the scar tissue from them remained within his body, and he kept he that they you could actually touch his abdomen and could feel where the scar tissue was.
Oh, really?
Hmm.
You never met the man, though, did you?
Oh, I met him many times.
Oh, you did?
And oh yeah, yeah. In fact, when I started getting into the UFO thing in earnest in the 70s, I realized I knew somebody who actually had been burned by a flying saucer. One of the reasons I had been having lunch with his son today was because I knew the family. In fact, I lived on the same street they lived on and hung around with his son as a kid.
Is that right?
And so when this happened, I went to his to the home, and they had actually avoided publicity. They didn't want to talk to anybody after the initial flurry, but they knew me, so they allowed me in to talk with them, and I interviewed them all at length. The family was very gracious. Um, and as a matter of fact, um, the NBC show Unsolved Mysteries, not the Netflix version, which is quite recent, but the original one from the 90s, they wanted to do a feature on this, so they actually wanted to fly him and his family out to NBC where the set was to film a segment, and they had to be talked into it. And I argued with them that this would be a good opportunity. Maybe there's somebody out there who saw something, who knows something. That's the whole idea behind Unsolved Mysteries. So they flew me and Mr. Mahalik and his wife and the son out to NBC where they had the set, and they recreated his living room, that type of thing,
Hmm.
and they interviewed him. And so I'd known them for quite some time, and it's a very interesting case. As a matter of fact, I have one other thing to show you.
Sure.
The government of Canada recognizes it as a historical event, um, and what I have here is a coin struck by the Royal Canadian Mint commemorating the UFO case, and it's very unique. When you shine a black light on it, you see the UFO and the in the sky and the beam.
Ah,
Um, and I think they made 4,000 um, coins like this. It's pure silver. It cost $120 to buy, and it's sold out within 24 hours.
Oh boy.
On eBay, if you're lucky, you can find it for about $1,000 now.
Oh, gee.
But it's recognized by the Canadian government as as something that really occurred.
Yeah, that's amazing. Is
Mhm.
now all the documents that you said that the doctor's reports and all that, is that included in your book?
We actually reproduce some of the documents in the book. There's another side to this that I've recently retired from the university. I'm a
Hmm.
science writer, or I was a science writer. I still am a science writer. I'm still doing some writing. Um, and because I'd been, active on campus at the University of Manitoba for a number of years, I got to know some of the people in the archives. And most people are probably not aware that the University of Manitoba has one of the largest collections of paranormal documents and phenomena material um, anywhere anywhere around the world. It's one of the largest sets of documents and collections. I think they have almost 50 separate collections of people, including Dan Aykroyd's father, who was a paranormal investigator
Wow.
for reals. They have his files in his collection. Um, and the archivist had approached me uh, when we put out this book on the case in 2017 on the 50th anniversary. Um, Wanted to know if I would be interested in donating my UFO files, including all my files on the Falcon Lake case. And I said, sure. So all of my UFO files have now been transferred to the University of Manitoba archives, which includes something like, in addition to the 25,000 from the Canadian UFO survey, about just as many, maybe another 10 or 15,000 other cases, plus all my books. You can see behind me there, I don't have any books left, very few books, but I have some files and documents and so forth, and lots of tchotchkes and whatever.
Hmm.
But all my book collection, I had a library of 2,500 UFO books. Those have all been donated to the library, all the magazines and all that sort of stuff. And they have all the Falcon Lake UFO files there now. And the idea is that they're going to digitize them. They're seeking funding now to digitize them all, and so that people can do their own research.
That's amazing. So you donated your entire your
Everything,
the whole thing.
everything. Yeah, I have very little left now.
Wow. Um. Okay. So moving on.
Sorry. Before we move on,
Sure.
um, and I have to say this. I mentioned the coin and something else that attests to how important this case is. The Farmery Brewery put out a Falcon Lake beer.
Ah.
So, I mean, this is a really important case.
If they've got their own beer, well, hey, what can you say?
Right, yeah.
Um. Now I want to get into, and I'm sure you've talked to people about this. What about abductions?
Well, um, I, I'm puzzled by some of the cases that have come to me. Um, you know, um, abductees started coming out of the woodwork in the 1980s and into the 1990s, and I remember the first person who came to me with a story was after a lecture I had been given, or I was giving, and it was, I don't know, a couple hundred people had attended, and then everybody was clearing out of the auditorium, and this one guy had hung back, and he sort of, very shyly came up to me and said, "Can he talk to me about something that happened to him?" And and I said, "Well, yeah, sure, just tell me." He said, "Well, not here, can we meet somewhere?" And I said, "Well, I suppose." um, and he gave me his number, and I put it in a pocket, and I actually forgot about it.
Mm.
And then I forgot what I was doing with my suit, and I pulled it out, and I thought, "Oh, I better call this guy." So I called him, and we agreed to meet at a McDonald's.
Ah.
And I met him, and he started telling me his story about being abducted. And it was, fairly, like you've seen on some TV shows. But remember, this is at the beginning, so there weren't a lot of stories about it quite yet. But his story was that he was in bed, and he was just starting to fall asleep when all of a sudden he realized he couldn't move.
Mm.
And he was paralyzed, and um, he saw and felt a presence coming through the door of his room, like through the wood, and it manifested into a creature. And it was not not the guy with the round eye, with the slant eyes, but something with a little more roundish eyes, kind of a little helmet on it, and in a sort of blue coverall thing. And he was holding some sort of like a bar, like a little tube with a little knob on the end. And he approached him, and he felt something had happened, but he couldn't recall exactly what was going on. But he felt something had significant had occurred, and it was bothering him. And I thought, well, what can we do about this? Well, because it was associated with the university, um, I had some colleagues in the psychology department. I actually had a psychology minor as one of my degrees,
Mm.
and I said, is there anybody who wants to talk with this fellow with me? Turns out that one of my colleagues was actually in the clinical psychology department who routinely used hypnosis and had worked with the police a number of occasions to help people relax and better, comprehend what some of the experiences they had had. And he said he was willing to take him on as a patient, necessarily about some of his anxieties, but would be able to use the hypnosis to try and understand what had happened. Um, and they agreed, both this fellow and the psychologist had agreed to let me watch. And it was actually just, kind of cool. It was behind a one-way mirror, where I was in the, behind that. They couldn't tell that I was there, and I was listening and watching the whole thing. This fellow was with the psychologist, and, laid him down on the couch, put him into a trance. And the psychologist said, "Okay, now we're going to go back, count to 10, and just imagine that day. What did you experience?" And we went through, again, you can just imagine some of what occurred if you're familiar with the memes and tropes. Um, and he remembered again being in bed, and this thing came in. He remembered him a lot clearer now, and this being that had the little rod with the knob on the end was approaching him, approaching him, approaching him. And just remember, this guy's in his trance, laying on the couch. The psychologist is sitting next to him, and he's recalling, yes, and it's getting closer, and it's getting closer, and he's going to touch my forehead with this little knob. And when he did, he jumped out of the this little couch, wide awake, and he was panicked. He had to be restrained. He had to calm him down. The psychologist, eventually got him back on track, and then was able to finish the session.
Mm.
And he said that when this knob, had touched his forehead, all his memories, his life, and the whole universe seemed open to him, and all this sort of stuff. Um, and later on, the psychologist has said, he'd been practicing for like 35 years and had never had anyone with such a violent reaction as that.
Mhm.
And he was baffled by it. Was quite fascinating. But this fellow had a lot of concerns. He was concerned that the creatures were still watching him. He had seen a number of UFOs near his home, and he was, very, very anxious, very, very worried, very paranoid that something was going to be happening to him. He actually attempted suicide.
Oh.
And this led me and I'm fairly firm on this, that I don't think UFO investigators have any business being involved with abductions. That we're not therapists, we're not trained physicians. We're not. This is not the field that we're trained for. That this should be something that psychologists, clinical psychologists, and indeed medical professionals should be the ones working with abductees. And so I get nervous when people, take courses in hypnosis and suddenly declare themselves abduction experts and
Hmm.
helping abductees. So I have a lot of concerns about that. And This also reflected in the fact that during this period and before, this had happened, and in the intervening months, a number of people had come to me with the stories, and I actually had grudgingly created an abductee support group here in Winnipeg, and there was about a dozen people um, that operated much like I don't know, a Al-Anon or a Gamblers Anonymous group or something like that, where it was a very safe place to talk about stuff. But it was generally considered, it got out of favor among psychologists because, there was some danger of contamination that, um, Shirley, thought that her abductors, had round eyes, whereas Dwayne thought that they had slanted eyes. And then eventually, oh, yeah, you're right, they were slanted eyes too,
Hmm.
that type of thing.
I see what you
So
mean.
it wasn't doing anybody much good, but it did help them to a certain extent. And I understand they kept on going. I withdrew completely and I said, guys, you have to do this on your own because I simply can't help you. Maybe you can find a therapist to help. So I withdrew. I understand the group continued for some time, and I'm not entirely sure what happened after that. But it was very interesting talking with people who had had these experiences. One of my books is titled "Abductions and Aliens: What's Going On," and documents some of my research into the phenomena.
Is there another story you might be able to share from within Manitoba in terms of abductions?
In terms of abductions, sure.
Yeah.
Um, One of the most interesting ones. Um, uh, well, I'll tell you the one about the nurse. Um, I remember being contacted by this woman who, just, matter of fact, she called me up on the phone and said, I have an interesting story. I think I may have, encountered aliens. Would you be interested in talking with me? And I said, well, at that time I said, sure, I can certainly talk with you. So I remember meeting her. And her story was that she was a nurse, been a nurse for a number of years, had been working a night shift. And she'd been working a night shift for many years. And, these days, nurses tend to pull multiple shifts, many hours, and are completely exhausted. And back then, I guess it wasn't as bad as it is now, but she was working multiple shifts and had been working a number of shifts in a row. And she, didn't have time for TV and movies and all that sort of stuff. She said, I don't watch Star Trek and anything like that. I don't have the time. Haven't been to a movie in years. But she remembers that her story is that she had come home after a shift, middle of the night, was living in kind of a condo complex, and she was living in this particular condo complex near the university. And she came in, and she'd come into her condo from the hallway, entered her door, was in her living room, was starting to get things ready, and had gone into the bedroom and was starting to get ready for bed because she had another shift coming up, in another 8 to 10 hours or 12 hours or whatever it was, and might have been called by any time. So she was still had her all clothes on. She was, starting to get things ready, and she heard a bang, boom, and a thump. and it seemed to come from by the doorway. So she went into her living room, and there in her living room, she says there were these two beings. And again, they were not the standard slanty gray guys. These were creatures with big round heads and big round eyes, all in white, with what looked like white togas um, that they were wearing, and then two arms, each of them. No mouths. All she could see were these two white eyes that were staring at her. Well, her first reaction was that it was close to Halloween, and she thought, "Oh, kids are playing some prank." So she yelled at them. She said, "You guys, you kids, university kids, get out of my apartment. It's really, really late. What are you doing here?" And they stared at her, and then they stared at each other, and then stared back at her. And all of a sudden, she felt some telepathic message. We mean you no harm. We're here to be your friends. We want you to come with us for a ride in our ship. And what a great line! Come with me for a ride, baby.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but she was sort of flustered, and she said, "Well, I got to be up in a while. Why?" And they said, "Oh no, please come with us. We're your friends." And so she said, "Sure." And the next thing she remembers, just in an instant, was that she is in a giant big auditorium or a giant hangar, huge, huge room where there were a bunch of other flying saucers and of different shapes and sizes. She was walking. One of these creatures was in front of her, one was behind her, and they were guiding her towards this one where there's sort of a gangplank leading up to a doorway into one of them. They led her into one and then down this sort of hallway inside, and then sat her down, one on either side of her at a control panel and a big TV screen. This is, long before we had screens that big.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and she said on the screen was a picture of the Earth. And they manipulated some dials and stuff, and the Earth got smaller and smaller and smaller. And she's looking around and what's going on. And then the next thing she knows, she's sitting on her bed in her bedroom. Her clothes are still on, but she's sitting on the other side of the bed that she would have come in on. And it's 3 hours later.
Hmm. Time
And
lost.
time loss, something happened. And she said, I don't watch, sensational stuff, not into science fiction. I didn't have a bad anchovy pizza to eat before I got home. I never have vivid dreams. What do I do? And I said, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. What do you want me to do? And she says, well, I don't know, nothing. I just felt you're the guy who wanted to know about this. So I'm telling you about it. And that was as far as it went.
Wow.
And what do you do with cases like that? There's no tangible evidence, there's no tangible proof. But she said it happened, and she seemed sincere. She didn't. I said, "Do you want me to tell the media? Do you want me to go to the Winnipeg Sun or the Free Press or CBC or somewhere?" No, no, don't tell anybody. The details. I'm just telling you the story,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where it left. That's where it left. So what do you do with cases like that?
How was she left? Was she left fearful,
No, she was just completely baffled.
but at
Very
peace?
strange. At peace, yeah.
At
She was
peace.
just at peace. She said, "I don't know what it was. That's just what happened to me."
Maybe you know the number. I don't know. How many cases of abduction do you think there are per year in North America?
Oh boy. Omni Magazine did a survey of its readership, and they thought that some absurd number, like 25% of the readership were abducted, and they extrapolated. And I don't know. I mean, during the heyday of the 80s into the 90s, I guess I may have had several dozen people come to me with stories like that.
Mm-hmm.
Not exactly the same, but similar stories. They've faded quite a bit from time to time. Abductees have not gone away. In fact, they've been largely supplanted by contactees. People come to me, with revelation that the aliens have chosen them to pass along their messages to humans that we're messing up the climate, we're at war, we should have peace, and all that sort of stuff. The contactee stories haven't changed since the 1950s, which makes me think that that's sort of a consistent phenomenon all to itself.
Hmm.
Um, and there's some amazing. I mean, there's stories that people are claiming that similar to this woman, this nurse, that they were taken on board, and they put a contraption on them, their heads, and they were able to fly the UFO themselves using their telepathic powers or with their minds.
Oh.
Um, there's no proof it happened. People have come up with all sorts of things. People have said that they've visited other planets. They've visited the civilization inside the Earth. They have um, uh, invisible companions who are with them, who are spiritual entities from actual other dimensions. What do you do with these types of stories? Is it more of a psychological thing? Is it more of a sociological thing? Is it possible that aliens are so advanced that they transcend time and space? I don't know, maybe. But from a scientific point of view, we have to deal with what we can tangibly test and prove, and we just can't test and prove any of that stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, that's right. Um, in terms of contactees, can you you explained it, but can you go over that again?
Well, a contactee, I mean, this began in the 1950s. I'm trying to remember who the first one was. I think it was George Hunt Williamson, but I might be wrong. Um, but people who believed that they had encountered aliens in one form or another. Maybe they were driving along and they saw something land. There's a fellow named George Adamski who was with some friends, and a saucer had landed, and out of the saucer had come a creature, an alien. But this alien was not the gray-skinned little guy, but this was a very beautiful human, white-skinned, blonde-haired human from a civilization far in advance of ours, where war had been eliminated. There was no such thing as hunger and poverty and want for anything. We lived in peace and traveled throughout the universe in spaceships. That was a prevalent message from the contactees in one form or another throughout the 1950s. People had said that they were taken on board in some of these flying saucers to other planets. Um, and again, that these stories persisted for quite some time. Now, throughout history, there have been other people who had said that they were taken on board, had visited other realms and creatures from the planetary spheres. But it's only in the 1950s that they really became, a little more, I don't know, concrete. I don't know if they are, but
Um, Now, what about in Manitoba?
well, the ones I've told so far are all Manitoba.
Oh, they were.
Uh, oh yeah,
Oh, okay.
these are Manitoba. Um, I mean, I've had people contact me from all over the place, but I didn't have the opportunity to travel to see them. I leave those for other people to do. Leave the Quebec cases for the Quebec people to handle.
Yeah. Your books, there's 10,
Mhm.
right? And
Yep.
soon to be 11.
Well, I've got a few more in the works. I'm working on some. Yeah.
Okay. And they are all about incidents in Manitoba. Is that correct?
No, not all about Manitoba, as a matter
Except
of
for the
fact.
one with the uh, what was it called? Why are they here?
Abductions and aliens.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the cases in there were from Manitoba, but those were from all around the world that either had contacted me directly, or I did the research to better understand what was going on. Um, my first book was actually, I'm just looking on my bookcase here. Um, Mysterious Manitoba.
Ooh.
And it was all about not just UFOs, but also unusual other phenomena. In fact, it was the one that followed right after was called Unnatural History, which I documented UFO reports in Manitoba and also Sasquatch, lake monsters, ghosts, and paranormal phenomena, and other unusual things that go bump in the night. So that was all from Unnatural History. And I title it that because it's sort of the different history. You know, we hear
Hmm.
stories all the time, but this is things that supposedly really happened that are pretty different. And after that, I had a series of books. Um, there's one called The World of UFOs, which is all about UFOs from every continent. So I talk about the UFOs in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, and Antarctica. Um, there's a
Antarctica.
Antarctica. There was some UFOs reported from there,
Okay.
from some of the researchers. Um, there was I had one of my books is called The Big Book of UFOs, which really is a compendium of a lot of information about UFOs in general. Um, I had a interesting. I wrote a children's book called I Saw It Too, and it is a series of accounts by children who said that they had seen UFOs and had experiences, many of which were investigated by adults, and some had adults with them at the time. And it's written for children at a children's level, sort of ages 8 to 15 or so, and occurred to children as young as 5 years old. And it's sort of also sort of a educational book. So there are enrichment questions. What would you do if this happened to you? Do you
Hmm.
think this is possible? That type of thing. And it's illustrated by a manga artist. It's I've approached the UFO phenomenon from a lot of different aspects, and have written about what people have told me in one form or another.
Wow. And what's in the works? Can you give us a little sneak peek?
Yeah, the works is that I'm working on sort of the sequel to Canada's UFOs Declassified, bringing the story from the 80s to the present day, including a lot of government documents that I received over the past 20 or 30 years or so. Um, Plus, I want to do an update of the unnatural history in Manitoba. It was written in the 90s, and you can just imagine over the past 30 years, there's a lot more interesting cases that occurred that need to be documented. Um, Plus, there's some multimedia things. I'm going to be at Cinematheque on April the 1st. Talking about the Chinese balloons
Hmm.
and how what's happening in Canada. Um, and on the May long weekend this year, so the 55th anniversary of the Falcon Lake, I'm going to be with Stan Mihalik, the son of the fellow that this happened to, and we're going to be giving a talk. And there's actually a guided horseback ride out to the site. So
Oh.
there, there's things like that that are constantly going, and there's um, uh, uh, a live action and animated series called The Strangeness Index, which I participated in, which is going to be the teaser trailer is going to be released at Cinematheque in April, and I think the entire film is going to be produced in or available in the fall sometime. So
Your
there's lots of
involvement with that was what?
uh, I was filmed for it. I provided the case details and some of the information, and I sort of walk. I sort of take part in an investigation on screen, so
Oh, okay.
it gives you an idea what the types of things are involved.
Now, just before we went on air, I asked you if you knew two people. Uh, you also sort of have a little bit of an involvement in the paranormal.
Right. I did investigate some ghosts and hauntings here in Manitoba. That was part of the unnatural history because I realized that it hadn't been that type of thing had not been documented very much at all up until that point. So I spent time investigating some haunted houses, talking with people who had had ghost experiences, hauntings, poltergeists, the whole thing. So I was heavily involved in that. But between Sasquatch and lake monsters and ghosts and all that sort of stuff and UFOs, I had to pick one.
Yeah.
So I picked the UFO as the
Yeah.
one that I would be most involved with. But from time to time, I still have been called upon to assist or give my opinion on some of the other cases. So I think I'm still on the books as an advisor for the Winnipeg Paranormal Group,
Yeah.
which Kelly Smith and Ashley Barnes are involved with. When I investigated the Mother Tucker's restaurant, which is closed now,
Yep.
but I actually found uh, two coffins which were in the building. One was a child's coffin, and the other one was a full-sized coffin that was on the roof of the restaurant, unbeknownst to everybody. And a lot of people in the
Really?
restaurant had said that, and the staff had actually seen some strange things happening and heard very odd noises and things like that. And I document that in my book on natural history. So Manitoba has a very strange phenomena in general.
Oh, your video is freezing up on me, Chris.
It is.
Oh, there we go.
I had just stopped moving.
Yeah. No, the sound kind of went dead and you just froze.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I'm back.
Okay. Put me into a panic there for a second.
Well, the government is trying to cover this up, so you're lucky that you got me this long.
That's right. Yeah. They're monitoring me right
Yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah.
um so you retired from U of M when?
Just a few months ago.
Oh, that recently.
Hmm.
Oh, okay.
But I continue. My job was a science writer, so I've been writing about science and trying to make it understandable to everybody, all the gee whiz stuff, and I continue to do that.
It's
And
happening
I continue,
again.
and I continue to be involved with scientists and who are doing research into UFOs all around the world. There's a group called the Galileo Project, for example, which you may have heard, based out of Harvard, of a group of scientists that are trying to document and trying to detect unidentified aerial phenomena in real time with a series of cameras and magnetometers and so forth. So there's a great interest in the scientific community now about these types of phenomena.
So your involvement was also into the United States.
Oh yeah, all around the world, absolutely. Yeah,
Um,
I represent Canada to a number of international organizations.
okay. You said something that piqued my interest. You said something about UFO activity at the Antarctic.
Well, yeah, there have been UFOs reported on all continents
Every
and
continent?
every continent. Yeah, and I even found some reports. I'm trying to remember them off the top of my head. I'd written about it years ago now, but I seem to recall that some scientists who were at probably McMurdo Station um, reported seeing some lights moving in the sky that they couldn't explain. So,
Hmm.
there are reports on every continent.
What did you think if you saw the movie about Fire in the Sky?
Well, as a matter of fact, that's the film that the Cinematheque is going to be screening, and I'm going to be giving commentary on.
Ah.
Um, um, we actually received complimentary passes to the to the first screening of Fire in the Sky when it was here in Winnipeg, myself and my colleagues,
Mm-hmm.
um, because I can't remember the film studio, whether it was Paramount or 20th Century. But anyways, they had found out who the UFO people were in all these cities where it was screening in and gave us free passes. We went, and this was before Facebook. This
Mm-hmm.
was when there was still FidoNet and things like that. And I remember we sat through the movie, and we were actually a little disappointed
Oh,
because we thought the film was well done. The characterization of the sheriff, played by James Garner, for example, was really well done.
yeah.
We thought it told the story really well, except the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes of the movie, where we actually see Travis Walton go into the spaceship, or he's in the spaceship. Instead of being accurate to what Travis Walton said happened, they made it up. They sort of they made up their own version. So he wakes up in this gooey
Yeah.
pod, sort of with insects and all this sort of stuff, which didn't happen, and that turned us right off.
Mm.
So I wrote a really bad review and posted it online. And it was 2 or 3 days later that I had a phone call from Hollywood,
Ah.
from the producer, Tracy Torme, the son of Mel Torme, by the way.
Ah.
Um, he said, I'm calling because yours is the only bad review we've had. Everybody else loves the movie. And he said, what's wrong with you? And I said, well, so I explained. I said, look, it's accurate up until that point. We don't understand what went wrong. And we argued for about an hour on the phone.
Mm.
And at the end of the hour, he said, well, yes, we had to change the script because it was too similar to Close Encounters.
Oh.
And, and, ever since then, Tracy and I have been best friends, and we've been talking on the phone every once in a while.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
um, and as I say, it was the characterizations of some of the people are actually quite well done. I've met Travis Walton a number of times now. Have had dinner with him. Um, I think he seems sincere. He had kept quiet for many years. He seems sincere, although there's a lot of evidence now. Some of his colleagues, the loggers that he had been with, claim that they were bought off to hoax the whole thing, and the place where it happened, people misled the investigators, and it actually took place somewhere else. Um, so I think it's all very muddy now. Um, and if it's not true, he's told a pretty good story, anyways. And I'd have to say, as far as the movie goes, it's interesting, but remember that the last part didn't happen.
Well, it's Hollywood after all.
It's Hollywood, absolutely. Yeah.
That's right. Well, Chris, we're going to wrap things up. I know it's getting close to your bedtime, as you told me before we
I'm
went on
really,
to air.
really, I'm really old, not like you. Come on.
So thank you so much for being on the show. And I'm going to throw up on the screen right now here. I'm not going to throw up on the screen. What am I saying?
Well, it's
I am going to throw onto the screen contact information. If you want to get a hold of Chris, there's the CanadianUFOReport.com website. And then there's an email address, CanadianUFOReport@hotmail.com. Chris, I'll make sure to put that in the description of the video. So they're just links. Somebody wants to get to it, they just click on it.
mm-hmm.
So thanks again, my friend, for coming on to the show.
Thank you very much, Dr. Talk, and we've had a good talk.
And maybe we can do this again sometime.
Maybe.
All right, take care.
Okay. Good night.
Just sit tight.